1,000 years of history under one roof. The National Archives, a treasure house of secrets. The records of extraordinary times and people. These files are this nation's story, our shared past.
Documents housed here were highly classified, intended for the eyes of only the privileged few, protected from your sight for decades, but not now.
I've been granted special access to files once kept hush-hush. I'll unearth amazing tales from our hidden history. Forget what you've been told. These documents tell the truth. Coming up in this programme, On Trial, the magazine that found itself in the dock and the moral campaigner who put it there.
Last Thursday evening, we sat as a family and we saw a programme that was the dirtiest programme that I have seen for a very long time.
Psychic or fraudster? The last woman to be jailed under the witchcraft laws.
People came forward and said that they had shaken hands with the spirits and described exactly what they had seen. It was quite extraordinary and in a way impressive.
And the Church of England's shameful secret, the files that reveal its role in slavery.
These pages bear the musty smell of their 200 years and also the stench of hypocrisy.
In matters of the law, one question has been asked since biblical times. Does God need our protection? Do I have the right to be offensive about your religion? During most of our history, laws forbade blasphemy. But as our society became more secular, most of those fell by the wayside. So it seemed astonishing and anachronistic when the veteran campaigner Mrs. Mary Whitehouse brought a private prosecution for the common law offence of blasphemous libel against the magazine Gay News for a poem that it published in 1976. Mrs. Whitehouse made a formidable enemy. The teacher from Warwickshire had come to prominence a decade earlier with her moral crusade against the BBC, which she accused of broadcasting filth. Her Clean Up TV petition attracted 500,000 signatures.
We recognise that the period between 6 and 9:15 is a period for family viewing. Well, I think we're being palmed off. Because last Thursday evening, we sat as a family and we saw a programme that started at 6:35. And it was the dirtiest programme that I have seen for a very long time.
But the founder of the National Viewers and Listeners Association had concerns beyond broadcasting standards, including the fall in religious observance.
All of them, I think, objecting to the blasphemy. The reason why God and the Virgin Mary hadn't had any more children except Jesus Christ was perhaps because they were on the pill.
And there was the rise of the so-called permissive society.
As a teacher responsible for sex education, I had it laid upon me to give children sex education based on chastity before marriage and fidelity within it.
But this poem outraged her most. It also presented her with her greatest challenge: to defend God in a court of law. It was called The Love That Dares to Speak Its Name. It is an erotic fantasy about a gay centurion who takes Christ's body down from the cross, and it's about what he does with the body next. And it is accompanied by an illustration. Even by 21st century standards, it is pretty strong stuff. So strong that even today I couldn't read it on television. But back in 1977, Mary Whitehouse wanted to go further than merely getting it banned. She launched a private prosecution against Gay News for blasphemous libel. It would be the first trial of its kind for 50 years. In his summing up, the judge laid out the terms of the debate. There are some who may think that permissiveness has gone far enough and that this poem has gone beyond what is permissive. There are others who may think that there should be no limit whatsoever to what may be published. The trial lasted 6 days. Inside, high-profile witnesses gave evidence for the defence, and outside there were protests from both sides.
Please take a copy of the offending poem for why the gay news is in court.
You have blasphemed my Lord Jesus Christ in that court. You have.
The decision was for the jury. But the judge made it pretty clear on which side he came down, as the documents reveal. If you were asked to read it aloud to an audience of fellow Christians, would you do it? And if you did, could you do it without blushing? Well, perhaps not surprisingly, with a summing up like that, the prosecution was successful. The editor, Dennis Lemon, and Gay News were found guilty, and Lemon was given a 9-month prison sentence, suspended for 18 months. Mary Whitehouse viewed this verdict as a watershed victory for Christian values. After the trial, she declared, "I'm rejoicing because I saw the possibility of our Lord being vilified. Now it's been shown that he won't be." For those on the other side, it was a clear defeat. Gay News was a rallying point for a community that in the 1970s was still marginalised. Among them was a young man who'd become first a keyboardist in the band The Communards and later a Church of England vicar.
My first contact with the gay scene, so I was a 16-year-old gay teenager in Stratford-on-Avon. As you can imagine, the opportunities to range widely across gay culture were rather limited, but I could get Gay News, and I did. It used to arrive in a plain brown envelope at my digs, and I would read it and follow the trial there. And so Gay News was my sort of point of contact with a wider community of people, where it wasn't simply about sex, often sex obtained by slightly unattractive means. It was about a community of people with a set of beliefs who had a certain investment in an idea of personal freedom and a vision of a society that would be in some ways liberated, part of a wider programme to do with sexual equality, racial equality and so on. And so that was something I rallied to.
As a leading figure in the nationwide Festival of Light group, Mary Whitehouse held mass gatherings in Hyde Park and Trafalgar Square, always capable of making a rousing speech.
The whole world has a problem of moral pollution, and once again Britain has the chance today to give leadership to the whole world.
Often her addresses focused on the rise of the gay movement, but despite enjoying obvious support, she didn't speak for all Christians.
I think she gave voice to a particularly poisonous and nasty and also illegitimate set of beliefs, a sort of set of prejudices against gay people in particular, which I found very objectionable and something worth fighting against. So I think Mary Whitehouse was a sort of figurehead for a set of feelings and beliefs and opinions and also ways of intervening in the public sphere that represented a challenge to people like me.
The judge at one point says that the jury should, as one of their tests, think about whether they'd be willing to read it aloud to a Christian audience. If they did read it aloud, could they do so without blushing? Did that strike you as a reasonable summing up on the charge of blasphemous libel?
I'm just trying to imagine reading it to my mother's union meeting on a Thursday afternoon. I don't think they're quite ready for that, although they are, in fact, perhaps more broad-minded than I give them credit for. But it's a different sort of thing. I think anything can be said. We may need to brace ourselves to hear it. It may be something we don't want to hear, and it may indeed outrage us fundamentally, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't be said and shouldn't be heard.
Mary Whitehouse won a battle, but not a war. The crime of blasphemous libel has been abolished. People marched to defend the right to give offence. But as a campaigner, she earned a place in history.
It was an era of powerful figures, and Mary Whitehouse was such a figure, I think. In a way, she was not that dissimilar from Margaret Thatcher in the political world. She was this kind of iron lady, if you like, and she was someone against whom we could rail and against whom we could direct our vituperation and our anger. And having said that, now, I always thought there was a certain pathos to her too, and that feeling of pathos increased as history went its way.
For centuries, kings and queens in the British Isles asserted that they derived their authority from God. So those who practiced witchcraft could be seen as not only heretical, but also subversive, guilty of a capital offence. On occasion, fear of what they could do would provoke a mass rooting out, or witch hunt.
Laws against witches. That sounds like a throwback to our primitive past. But here in the archives, I have a document that raises a question with a surprising answer.
When was a woman last imprisoned under the Witchcraft Act of 1735? In the 18th century, in the 19th century? I was astonished to learn from these files that it was during the Second World War.
Her name was Helen Duncan, and she was known for a rather unusual talent to produce ectoplasm from her mouth. Some observers thought it took the form of dead loved ones. Others were merely reminded of a white sheet. Like many other mediums, she travelled the country, holding seances and claiming to talk to the dead. But during the Second World War, her supposed skill to see what others couldn't brought her into conflict with the state. In 1941, Helen Duncan held a séance in Portsmouth. Here she conjured the spirit of a dead sailor who had apparently served on the battleship HMS Barham, which had been sunk by a German U-boat. But news of that sinking was at that point still a highly classified state secret, not to be released for fear of damaging British morale. The authorities were alarmed and took action to silence her.
She was arrested during one of her séances by Royal Naval Volunteer Reservists. One of them here, Stanley Raymond Worth, he says that another reservist, Cross, gave the chair in front of him a violent push forward and leapt forward. I switched on my torch and illuminated the scene. I saw him grasping the prisoner, who seemed to be trying to get rid of a piece of white material which she was pushing away from her, but it fell to the floor. The séances were conducted with a dim red light, but almost immediately the white bulb was replaced by a member of the audience which illuminated the room. When the light came on, Cross said to me, "Did you get the sheet?" I replied, "No, it's gone into the audience." Mrs. Duncan said, "Of course it's gone. It had to go somewhere." At no time did she deny that it was a sheet. And so, maybe in an attempt to shut her up, she was taken to the Old Bailey and tried for witchcraft.
The authorities had considered charging her with vagrancy, but fearful that she might blurt out other military secrets, they sought a way of putting her in prison. Better to use the Witchcraft Act of 1735, which provided for custodial sentences against those who fraudulently claimed to have witches' powers. It's a paradox that she had to be shut up for fear that she could sense national secrets, but was tried as an obvious fraud. It was a circus, which privately appalled even Winston Churchill.
The sensational trial came to the attention of the Prime Minister, who was moved to write a minute. What was the cost of this trial to the state? observing that witnesses were brought from Portsmouth and maintained here in this crowded London for a fortnight, and the recorder kept busy with all this obsolete tomfoolery to the detriment of necessary work in the courts. Signed, W.S.C. Winston Churchill.
The trial took place over 70 years ago, but I found someone who witnessed it. Professor Donald West was a young psychic researcher who attended the courtroom day after day.
Did you attend with any preconception as to whether Helen Duncan was genuinely possessed of spiritual powers, or whether perhaps she was a fraud?
Well, at that time, I had no very fixed opinion. Certainly, listening to all those people who came forward and said that they had shaken hands with the spirits and described exactly what they had seen and so forth, it was quite extraordinary and, in a way, impressive.
Do you have a memory and image in your mind of Helen Duncan, the defendant, appearing in the dock?
Oh, yes. She was certainly not a pretty woman. Plump and very dour looking, and that's about it, I think. And of course, she didn't give evidence, so one didn't hear her arguing the case.
Despite a string of witnesses saying that Helen Duncan was genuine, the jury found her guilty of fraud under the Witchcraft Act. Her sentence, 9 months in jail.
Did you have a feeling about the verdict and the sentence? Did it cause any emotion in you?
I was really, at the time, didn't quite know what the jury would decide. It wasn't surprising, but, you know, if it had gone the other way in view of all those witnesses, I wouldn't have been surprised either. But now, of course, I can see that the jury naturally believed the policeman rather than all these crazy people who described impossible things.
And is it your conclusion, then, that people were so deceived?
Oh, I'm sure of that, yes. And I'm also sure that Mrs. Duncan did commit many frauds.
So Helen Duncan was legally determined to be a trickster and imprisoned at a time when keeping secrets was vital to winning the war. And yet, a big question remains. If she was a fraud, how did she know about the secret of HMS Barham's sinking? An historian of witchcraft may provide an unmystical answer.
She arouses suspicion because she mentions the fate of HMS Barham, a battleship that has been sunk, but that is a secret. How on earth could she have known?
Well, the spiritualist movement sometimes say that the only way she could possibly have known, because it was a secret, the only way she could have known is because she had contacted the spirits of the dead. Well, who knows? But there is a more prosaic story behind it, which is that the government did actually inform the families of those who had died on the Barham that it had gone down, but they were told not to say anything. Well, this was a Portsmouth ship, and we're talking about nearly 900 men. That's 900 families, say 10 people in a family and their friends, and you multiply it up. It's plausible that maybe, almost immediately, 20 to 30,000 people in England knew that Barham had been sunk. So, given that Helen Duncan is a sensitive medium, by which I mean she's listening out for information all around her, she's in Portsmouth at that time, I think it starts to seem quite, not just plausible, but even likely that she would have heard that the Barham had been sunk.
The date of Mrs. Duncan's arrest is significant, 1944, the year in which the D-Day invasion of Nazi-occupied France would be launched, when the motto was, "Loose lips might sink ships."
Do you think that plays a part in Helen Duncan's fate?
I think it does. Obviously, that this is a matter of intense sensitivity, the greatest seaborne invasion in the history of the world, and obviously the turning point in the war to open up the Second Front. So that around this planning for D-Day, inevitably there is going to be intelligence work that might be very high level against German spies, but also low level too, just against people who were shooting their mouths off.
And she's an intelligent woman with extraordinary antennae.
Yeah.
She's a blotting paper that absorbs information, and she's wandering around the south of England, which is where most of the activity is.
I think that's it in a nutshell.
It's you, Lily Marlene.
Mrs. Duncan was the last woman to be imprisoned under the Witchcraft Acts. In 1951, Churchill's government made sure that there would be no more tomfoolery when it repealed the laws. And in 1956, Helen Duncan passed over to the other side. The courts of law give us the chance to judge innocence and guilt. But is guilt reduced or removed by the passage of time? That's the question raised by our next document. For more than 300 years, European merchants forced Africans onto slave ships and transported them across the Atlantic Ocean. And Britain played a huge part in this human trade. British ships carried around 3 million slaves to America and the Caribbean, where they worked on plantations, helping to build the wealth of the City of London. The trade made many organisations rich, and I've discovered in the archives that that includes a very surprising name.
God Almighty has set before me the abolition of the slave trade. So wrote the great reformer William Wilberforce. And yet, during the 18th century, there were slaves in the Caribbean who bore branded on their chests the word society. This 1817 register of slaves in Barbados reveals that society means the honourable and reverent society for the propagation of the gospel in foreign parts, the missionary arm of the Church of England. And here is that society listed as owning some 400 slaves. Listed here then is every man, woman and child owned by the society. We see that their ages range very considerably. Cudjoe is 70 years old and he's working as a domestic. It seems that Ben George can be set to work as a grass gatherer even though he's only 10 years old. Some slaves are still alive at a very grand age. Here's Rita, who's 90 years old. She's infirm. She's no longer working. But on the other hand, Orkoa and Kwashiba, who are both 80 years old, are both still working as nurses.
The documents don't reveal the conditions that some of the slaves would have endured. 12-hour working days in intense heat, punishments such as the lash or being put in leg irons. For the slave owners, like the church, it was the profit of the plantation that mattered.
These pages bear the musty smell of their 200 years and also the stench of hypocrisy.
Today we can still see the wealth in our capital constructed on the foundations of slavery. The Corporation of London had its seat in the magnificent Guildhall. Sir William Beckford made a fortune from slave plantations in Jamaica and was twice Lord Mayor. Robert Beckford's ancestors worked under him.
Robert, what do you know of your own slave origins within your family?
The name was given as a brand to slaves on the west of the island where the Beckford family, who were a slave-owning family based in England, had most of their slaves. So although my name is Robert Beckford, my real name would be an African name. So Beckford is in essence a slave name.
William Beckford, the Lord Mayor, might have been focused on profit, but the church added a moral purpose to slavery.
They recognise that slavery is problematic, but they also recognise that these slaves, that Africans, come from this dark continent, and therefore they need to be civilised. And slavery, while not perfect, provides an opportunity for bringing Africans into the body of humanity.
Does the Church of England succeed with this mission of civilising the slaves?
It's a complete failure. They failed to convert the numbers that they had hoped to, partly because Christianity provides a point of resistance for slaves. How do you resist this terror? Well, you refuse to take on their religion. They brand slaves with hot irons as a sign of ownership, and they flog them to death, and they also sell them off when they can't work anymore.
So they don't treat them any better than slaves on any other plantation?
That's what the historical documents suggest, that the Church of England plantation is no different to any other plantation.
Glory, glory, hallelujah, when I lay my burden down.
The international slave trade was abolished in 1807. But it wasn't until 1833 that Parliament outlawed slavery as an institution. Compensation was paid, not to the slaves, but to their owners. Documents show that for freeing its slaves, the church received nearly £9,000, a fortune at that time.
We have in Britain today a history of churches, of church buildings that are built on the blood and sweat and brutalization of Africans. It's irreconcilable, I would think, with the heart of the Christian gospel, a gospel of freedom and justice.
Old pirates, yes, they rabbi, sold I to the merchant ships.
In 2006, the then Archbishop of Canterbury apologised for the Church of England's role. But neither it nor the state has met calls to pay reparations.
How do we compensate fully for this past? The argument is this. Britain benefited historically, structurally, economically from the slave trade, and many of the benefits are still with us in terms of the enrichment of the economy. Caribbean nations and Caribbean people were net losers from slavery, so they now feel they should be compensated. The reparations movement is not only about financial compensation, it's also about a psycho-social healing.
The brutality and injustice of slavery and the idea of white racial supremacy that underpinned it are now hard to understand. Whether this generation is bound to pay recompense for past abuses is hotly debated.
All I ever had.
Its historic actions clearly weigh on the conscience of the Church of England.
These songs of freedom.
In the documents that I've studied today, I was struck by Winston Churchill's exasperation that Helen Duncan was imprisoned under a witchcraft law 200 years old. Gay News magazine was doubtless astonished to be convicted in 1977 of the ancient offence of blasphemous libel. It's nearly 2 centuries since the Church of England owned slaves, but some campaigners would argue that the passage of time is irrelevant and that the former colonial powers should be atoning today for the racist crimes of yesteryear.